Lost Louisiana is supported by the Louisiana Department of Culture, Recreation, and Tourism. Through artistic support, libraries, museums, state parks, and historic areas, we're preserving and promoting our cultural heritage. Lost Louisiana is also made possible by the support of viewers like you.
By my side, the old cowboy song says, do not hasten to bid me adieu. It's time to remember the Red River Valley, to remember why it's hard to leave the side of its soft waters. I'm Jeff Dewey. 6 miles north of here is Arkansas. This bridge is Louisiana Highway 2. Beneath it, the Red River flows quiet and low. It's come from the foothills past Texas, through Arkansas, and now it's heading south. With the Red River at low volume, its bachelor lands in North Louisiana can look something like the surface of Mars, a deep red and just as serene. From here we continue our search for Lost Louisiana. From here we begin a trilogy of journeys down our great streams. Rivers run deep. This is the Red. A stone's throw east is Plain Dealing, a most western-feeling small town in the tradition of what we expect of the Old West. Wide streets, bright, dry old bricks, and the slow charm of another prettier time. Edna Clark retired to Plain Dealing to become the town barber.
This barber shop has been here for years and years. I know of 4 people that's had it. I think I was probably the 5th one that took it.
You still got the razor straps on that barber chair.
It's just an old-timey barber shop in a small town. Nothing fancy.
The river is just like 6-7 miles out to the Red River if we want to go fishing, and then you got Plain Dealing Lake that we can fish out there also. So we don't have a lot of the hustle and bustle in this community as you do in a big city.
Doesn't it look sort of like an old western town? You've got the dentist down the block.
Yeah.
You've got a cafe on the corner. You have a barber shop here. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Just the basics are here.
Yeah, you really do because of the way it's laid out. See, our general store was there 90 years before it got burnt down.
At the Giles Cafe, there's a plate lunch every day. Today, it's chicken and dumplings. Leon Sanders has been mayor for 40 years. He's just retired from his city duties, but is still here every day.
Well, I think people who live here and surrounding area, now when we say Plain Dealing, we're not talking about just those people who live within the corporate limits of the town. I like to refer to all the people of North Bossier Parish as being from Plain Dealing, because Plain Dealing is a central portion of the town. And at one time, the roads, every road leading out of Plain Dealing was lined with family farms. And the children grew up there and came to school in Plain Dealing. That doesn't exist anymore as such. There are no family farms. But back in days gone by, that was it. And Plain Dealing was a central shopping area of North Bossier Parish. Every building you see around here in this town was filled with a business of some kind.
Well, you know, I see a lot of different buildings, and we go to a lot of different small towns, and you have probably 24 old buildings right in the middle of town that are still standing is the good part.
Well, these buildings at one time were all occupied by businesses that supplied the people of the North Bossier Parish area with their needs. The stores, they would come to play in the shop. On Saturday afternoon, I have laughed many times as a kid. I stood on the sidewalk out there and watched the people. And one afternoon, this is a matter of this little personal thing that takes place. Two guys got in an argument. And one of them says, hey, I paid the last fine in this town I'm going to pay. I'm not going to pay another fine in this town for fighting. Let's go outside of town to fight. They took off right there, and they walked a half mile out to the corporate limits of the town, and they fought. And I, as a kid, didn't follow them, but a bunch of the guys did follow them and watched the fight. When they got through fighting a fist fight, they walked back to town. It was all over.
Good.
No guns, no knives. Just, but this guy made the statement, I have paid the last fine I'm going to pay. I'm not going to pay another fine for fighting in this town. Let's go out of town to fight. And they fought with a fist.
Sanders used to have the big mercantile in plain dealing, and we had come to see it. But in our search for lost Louisiana, things don't always work out. It burned down about a month before we got here. The old store that had been made into a town museum is a pile of bricks, no more than a great, sad gap in a downtown that's magnificently preserved, if not terribly prosperous looking.
And it's so sad to see the old mayor just walking up and down and walking through it and looking and hitting ashes, you know. And he had so much history in there. And then, of course, you had your other businesses. The lady that had the photographer has moved to Minden, I understand. And all that's building back is the hardware store.
Sam Walton's a great man. He was smart. He did what a lot of guys try to do and fail, but he ruined little towns. There's no question about it. When he established Walmart, because that killed the little towns, people who used to drive, as I say, from all of North Bossier Parish into plain dealing to visit, shop, and fight.
Fight? You bet. Just down the road a piece in Rocky Mount, some men got together 5 months before Fort Sumter, a month before South Carolina seceded from the Yankees. The men of Bossier got together and pledged their sacred trust to each other in their Declaration of Independence. It was November 26, 1860, and this became the free parish of Bossier. As much as any place that tries to lay claim to it, this is the cradle of the Confederacy. Here rebels first stood up to walk away. In a few years, they would know the price. There are even older dignities in the towns of this North Country. Not far is Minden, sanctuary for another people yearning to breathe free. This is Germantown Colony, one of the first German settlements in America.
A group of Germans left Germany for the purpose of worshiping as they pleased. Their leader was Count Leon. He believed there'd be a second coming of Christ, and he wanted to be the one to welcome him. Then they left there and came to Grandicore, Louisiana, at Natchitoches, where the log jam stopped them and yellow fever struck. And that's where so many died with yellow fever. So did the Count. So the Countess knew this was his place of coming. He was looking for a place as near like Jerusalem. This is the same latitude as the Jerusalem. She came on here. She helped the colony together to 1871 when her daughters married, and she joined them and went to Hot Springs, Arkansas.
Florence Krause has lived here for more than 55 years. Her husband's family is of the original lineage to a colony that flourished here until the Civil War ruined the economy and doomed their way of life.
Grandparents came from Germany and settled here, raised their family here. There was 11 children in my husband's family.
A recent restoration effort spearheaded by descendants of the colony lets you drift through their countess's home to see the old piano where she taught lessons in music and propriety to young ladies. The community kitchen is still here, as is the barn and smith works. The German settlers' farm equipment tells of long days and an ethic retained near their new Rhine, the Red. But we really shouldn't stray too far from the river's trail. We'll crisscross it many times on our way south, and for now take the west bank to Gilliam. The early settlement of Caddo Parish was hampered by a great raft of logs jammed across the Red River from bank to bank. But small paths were cut through the floating blockage, and a bachelor settled here. R.L. Gilliam wanted his name to live on, but he had no children. He granted the railroad passage through his new land if they would build a depot. They did. It was named for him and stayed busy as the only stop between Texarkana and Shreveport. Just downriver on the western side is Belcher, also named for a man who granted the railroad right-of-way. In the earliest years of the 20th century, a Belcher farmer wanted to dig a well. He kept hitting salt water at 400 feet, and any school child around here knows the rest of that story. The farmer gave up. He wanted cool water, not hot oil and gas. It was a boom in more ways than Louisiana's upper Red River were already prosperous by the 19-teens when gas hit big in the river frontage of old Shreveport. Pioneers, jazzmen, and can-can dancers drank the night away. This is where folk music legend Hughie Ledbetter sang his blues. In the rolling wake of the Red River, there's a feel of all those years of river commerce. Not something you can put a finger on, just an easy picture that lets the mind reel out something you remember about keelboats and steamers. On a stretch of highway through Bossier City, the remnants of old nightclubs call to mind recent years of tawdry commerce. The motels and fancy juke joints of the 1960s litter your path with great architectural icons of crazy nights and weekend passes from Barksdale Air Force Base. This is a Route 66 in 5 blocks. We've tried to tame the river. That's the human history of the Red, our applied desire to ride a rattlesnake of changing courses and unpredictable depths. Shreveport and Bossier are proud to be river towns. Ever since the great log jam was broken, chopped, drugged, dragged, sank, pulled, lifted, and punctured in the 1830s by crews led by Captain Henry Miller Shreve. Gary Joyner is a historian and Red River scholar at LSU in Shreveport.
The raft was like a living, breathing thing. It moved. The southern end kept on breaking off because it just rotted due to its own weight, and the northern end was building. At one point, the raft was 400 miles long. By the time Shreve gets here, it's down to about 110 miles. Just about 100 yards north from where we are is one of his more famous cuts that created Shreve Island. He did it in a day. He cut a ditch, 1 foot deep, 1 foot wide, from daylight to dark, opened the northern end, and by the next morning, steamboats could go through it.
Shreveport was the Confederate capital of Louisiana. For so much more than that, it would have been a great prize for the Union to seize. The river proved a lifeline for moving supplies from the west to the rest of the Confederacy, and here 31 ironclad or tin-clad battleships were built.
By 1864, there were only 4 targets worth taking, according to the Union High Command, in all of the South, and that's Richmond, Charleston, Mobile, and Shreveport. Shreveport was really important because it was the safest of the 4. It was insulated. It was far away from everything. It was the capital of Confederate Louisiana. It was the center for the Army of the Trans-Mississippi.
And New Orleans was under siege already by then.
New Orleans was in Union hands.
Yeah.
It's gone, militarily.
Yeah.
You have industry growing up here. You have cattle moving in here. It is the breadbasket that's feeding those armies. And as Napoleon said, an army marches on its stomach. We found recently that part of the problem with this campaign is that Banks was using a French-based map, Porter's using a Spanish-based map. His show the roads, Banks do not. Banks' river pilot was a second licensed river pilot after Henry Shreve on the river. His name was Wellington W. Withenbury, and he leased several thousand acres of cottonland right around in here. And his cotton had been harvested and was ready to come down, and he didn't want the Yankees to steal it, and he didn't want the rebels to burn it. And so he tells Banks, you know, there's a very fine road heading due west, and it goes from Natchitoches, and it goes to a little place that no longer exists as a viable town, Crump's Corners, and then moves up what is today Highway 175 to Pleasant Hill, from there to Mansfield, and from there you can come into Shreveport from the southwest, and the rebels will not be looking for you, and he believes him. And he's right, the road exists. Porter's saying, give me 3 days,
But the biggest ambush you've ever seen is down that road.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And he meets his match at Mansfield on April 8th. And then during the retreat, he has a tactical tie and a strategic loss because of a retreat at Pleasant Hill, and comes back to Grand Ecore where they hole up. Porter is fighting his way back south. He's having all kinds of problems. The Confederates are firing at him. Snipers are at him. His boats do not move well in reverse. Anchors are coming loose, rudders are coming loose, ropes are popping off, and in fact he loses his largest ship, the Eastport, trying to get south of Grand Ecore. Eastport was taken out by a mine that was made in Shreveport and laid by the crew, if not the boat, and maybe the boat, of an ironclad, the Missouri, that was built here. So it did get some action, although we never think about it.
Stories of the war and its aftermath are best illustrated by a walk along the Red. In 1873, the people of Caddo and Bossier parishes were so fed up with so-called Reconstruction rule that they tried to join Texas. Reenactors visit pivotal sites of the Red River Campaign every year. They come to feel what you can't put your finger on, a lonely, wanting call from the Red. You see, the Red is unspoiled by this century. Things are pretty much as they were when the Blues and Grays fought for it.
The war was over, but the ramifications of the war goes on. History follows the individual. History follows us today. And if we don't have a clear and correct understanding of that history, how will we ever know where we are going? Remember, Jefferson Davis, President of the Confederacy, warned us that if we, the South, lost the war for Southern independence, our children would be taught Southern history by the conquering Yankee.
Walter Kennedy and Gary Stevens wear the uniform of the Confederate soldier for battle recreations. They want people to remember the good and honorable part of a time when men and women fought and died for their beliefs alone.
To live in hearts we leave behind is not to die.
Constancy is a powerful thing. There's something about the Red River. It's easy on the eyes, on the senses, on the imagination once you face a little history. Something you can't quite put your finger on lingers in its silent, absolutely relentless passage south. Lost Louisiana, rivers run deep, the red. Valley, and a search for lost Louisiana. Rivers run deep. This is the red. These are the small towns and fine landmarks we have ignored for too long. There are two old courthouses in Natchitoches. One from 1940 features Art Deco Indians. Just next door is a still older one. Think turn of the century. On the second floor of Natchitoches' older courthouse, you'll find a library of genealogy materials, from birth records to real courtroom dramas.
Well, this is a court order. It's dated Friday morning, the 20th of August, 1790. The court met, and it was a state of North Carolina plaintiff against the defendant who was convicted for horse stealing, and therefore ordered that the said Elias be confined in the public pillory for 1 hour.
Is that all? I thought they hung horse thieves.
Well,
They were liberal in Natchitoches, huh?
well, he also got
They let him go.
he got a public whipping.
Oh, he got a public whipping. Well, I would hope so.
There are many abandoned stores on the east bank of the Red, south of Natchitoches. This one was built holding up the porch with well drilling bits. You probably wouldn't notice them unless you're looking. Do we notice anymore the faded signs, the rusted plows, the incredible links to our past that litter this land? Amazement can be found by the side of the road in Bermuda. One corner, one mass of unpainted wood, one hunk of disappointment. Regret for what? Shakespeare said beauty is also in that which survives.
It's moments like these that I'm really glad you're with us on these tours of Lost Louisiana, because this looks and feels exactly like it must have felt 1,000 years ago when the Coushatta were hunting and fishing here. It's a small bridge on Highway 1220. Try to find it on the map over Bayou Theo. This is what the tourism folks like to put on their posters and brochures, of course. Some of us here have a tendency to think that maybe we shouldn't, that maybe we'd get more Yankee invaders that way, this time as tourists.
As we head downstream, the Cane River is a reminder of how many times, even since Europeans arrived here, how many times the red has changed its mind. Try and hug the red on a drive down the smallest of paths. The cane will deceive you. It was once the red, but it's cast off now. The roads get smaller and hug the banks even tighter. Then they back into some mighty small corners. These are places seen only by the people who live here. Cotton bales dry tall in the ripe fields, just as it seems they always have. It's time for the harvest, and the fields are white unto harvest. Somewhere among the dry cotton and spiderweb-thin farm roads is a little town dampened by the Cane River and its many bayous, Clutcheville. In this area, a woman from Missouri set some stories that are now called some of America's finest literature. Kate Chopin poured out unpopular honesty about women's lives in Louisiana after the war. This is the landscape she drew on as inspiration, the old French settlements of the 1870s. Stories about the ruined lives of Creoles after the war.
There were acres of open land, cultivated in a slovenly fashion, but so rich that cotton and corn and wheat and cocoa grass grew rampant. The Negro quarters were at the far end of this open stretch and consisted of a long row of old and very crippled cabins. Directly back of these, a dense wood grew and held much mystery of a witchery of sound and shadow and strange lights when the sun shone. Of a gin house, there was left scarcely a trace.
Though Kate Chopin lived along the Cane River for only 3 years, this place remained in her memory, and she remains in ours for documenting life in this area more than a century ago. The Rochelle Cemetery is a fine old one. Of course, there are a lot of fine old cemeteries along the Red, but how many from so far back are still growing?
The grave of E.J. Vallier has ceramic knobs on the gate, and they're frozen shut.
And it is very much off the beaten path. There are times trying to follow the Red that you can come up against the limitations of smaller roads. Backtrack you must, but that's all right because you could see something you missed on the way in, like a bridge, an old hidden bridge in the woods that tells you there's an even older road paralleling your journey and lost somewhere in those woods. Across the Red again to Montgomery, and another cemetery in sight of the river. This one is on a steep hill. From here you can see the exact spot in the river where the Eastport sank. It was a Union ironclad, and it's still out there on the sandy bottom. Montgomery looks like a tiny town today. Of course, it wasn't built for today. It's the exact size of a Red River trading town of the last century. The width of the streets, the style of the buildings let you see the last century.
Montgomery may still seem to be something of a small town, but before the Civil War, this was a big shipping port. In fact, Union General Nathaniel Banks, when he's taking his campaign of northern aggression, as they called it, up through Confederate North Louisiana, well, after he shells the town of Montgomery, he personally gets out and leads a raiding party to first loot, then burn every house in town.
At least the local people got a good laugh a little later when Union Admiral Porter was making his hasty retreat south on the Red. He tried to save his precious ironclad, the Eastport, but couldn't, and instead of letting it fall into rebel hands, Porter scuttled his own boat right here at Montgomery.
Let me tell you a story about the town of Colfax. A wealthy cotton planter named Meredith Calhoun owned 14,000 acres along the Red River, and he also owned 1,000 slaves, but we're going to get to them in a second. Now, he made his homestead along something called the Rigolet de Bon Dieu, the bayou of a good or just God. Now, the Red River, in one of its flood stages, as it's wont to do in one of its fits and twists, took over the course of the Rigolet de Bon Dieu, turning Calhoun's homestead into Calhoun's Landing. The place became very popular. Now, fast forward through the War for Southern Independence and into Reconstruction. The leaders of that New South wind up naming this parish after President of the Union, Ulysses S. Grant. They named the town after Grant's vice president, Schuyler Colfax. There was just a lot of bad sentiment around here in Reconstruction. About 300 blacks, remember these are probably most of them recently freed blacks, they start a ruckus. A lot of white people are killed. You can imagine what's coming up. The posses, the vigilantes. This town is on the verge of blowing. When the white establishment and the outside world gets wind of what's going on in Colfax, boy, they head up themselves a posse. Maybe some whiskey's passed around. Certainly the vigilantes get together, overpower the guards that are keeping some of the blacks under control. The whites round up about 40 blacks. They take them to a tree, and en masse, they're hanging.
There was a Norman Rockwellian gas station in Colfax. The last time we came through, we took these pictures. This time we came through and it was gone. We want to grab pictures of the old landmarks before they're all gone. Sometimes ugly new things get in the way of a good photograph. Don't worry, Senator Smith, we stuck it back in the post holes. Look at this old hotel. It's a shame only to bemoan the outcast state of the landmarks we take for granted. This time, Colfax will not fool us. We're going inside the Lesage Hotel before it's gone, too.
Can I look in some of these?
Well, I don't have the keys, Jim.
Oh.
Somebody didn't return their key.
John Lesage used to run that old gas station they tore down. His family owned the hotel. Look at it.
These are original to the Lesage
1902, and the second one built on this spot. You could see the river from the front windows before they put in that levee.
You know, from this parlor, I'll bet a lot of businessmen and travelers had a beautiful view of the river right here, didn't they?
The river was right down there, Jeff. It cost $8,500 to build the hotel and $2,500 for the furniture.
My goodness. Do you remember how much it was to stay here a night?
Oh, no. See, the bidders came from Red River.
Yeah.
You know, the steamboats.
And the businessmen, and the traders, and
when they had court, judges came up and stayed maybe for a month, you know, and then went back to Ellick or New Orleans, where the Baton Rouge, where they came from.
This was once a prosperous town.
Well, no, not then, not those days.
No?
No. It was, had an old cotton house over there, and an old bank building over there, and just a few other structures in the house, and that was it. They operated on the, you know, on the river. And then when the railroad came through, well, that knocked it. And then when the highway came through, I think about 1910 or 12, well, then that really finished it.
John Lesage has a sad take on it all. He says he recognizes he won't be here much longer to take care of the hotel he now lives in.
Well, let's see.
He told me he's the last guest of the Lesage.
Thank you, Mr. Lesage, for talking with us.
Come and sit by my side if you love me. Do not hasten to bid me adieu. But remember the Red River Valley and the boy who has loved you so true.
Across the river again we go to an abandoned stretch of road called Old Highway 1. The only way to travel the path of the river was, until a few years ago, Highway 1, a two-lane from Arkansas to Grand Isle. Imagine what you'd find along a road called Old Highway 1. Rayford Knight had a paper box at his home near Zimmerman, north of Boyce. The local boys had little else to do. That's the story here.
About every time they'd get wound up good on that stuff, you know, they had to take my paper box down and put a little addition to it. Put the wings on it, you know, and put the seat on it and all this other snorting and snapping everything.
You mean the boys around here added to it enough?
Oh, yeah.
Because they were taunting you enough to...
No,
with
they
your paper
thought
box?
that much about me, and they'd steal it and go modify it and bring it back the next day or two, and everything worked out pretty good.
Hasn't anybody put anything new on it lately? Oh, well, I'm going to have to come by some night and put something new on it. I'll put your propeller on it.
They call this area Barrett, you know, near timber trails and Lee Heights. We've followed the course of the river as closely as possible. Of course, for most of the time, you can't see the water for the levee. And then there are the times you mistakenly think you can get to Alexandria from here. Farmer Bobby Smith helped with directions, and just as we're leaving, he casually mentions that old abandoned Tyroli graveyard.
Yes.
What do we have right over here?
That, they claim is an old cemetery that the people who used to work at a sawmill, this used to be a little sawmill town, and they were buried over there when they worked here. The sawmill cut out around 1900 or 1905 or something like that.
But there really isn't anybody around anymore who really knows the town of Tyroli.
Right.
Or that anybody lived and breathed here, really.
Right. That's exactly right.
But there's still that cemetery and the pecan trees.
Right.
Not a remnant remains of the town of Tyroli.
The river's changed course so many times over the years. Sometimes when you go looking for lost Louisiana, you don't find it.
There is redemption from the sins of our forgetting or letting things be washed away to weed. The night has cooled the red, but now the central Louisiana sun is misting it up again. Dawn in Alexandria is as pretty a town's awakening as any imaginable. Old bridges rise from the mist. The red pours from its bed like someone's dropped in dry ice. We'll stop into just one home built at the dawn of this area's European history. This is Kent House, now a state historic area. Amy Dufour helps preserve it.
Mr. Bayo received a Spanish land grant about 1796, and that consisted of 500 acres. And so that's what he started off with. He was married at that time, started building the house, the Kent House, that it's called today, and it wasn't completed until 1800. And in fact, something interesting at that time is that for each child that a couple had, they could petition the government for additional land. Oh. And the Bayos had 14 children.
Oh, okay. On this weekend, there was a family reunion of the descendants of the Bayo family. Arden Trifley remembers hearing the stories of this pioneer home from aunts and such since she was a little girl.
I remember my grandmother's sisters all talking about burying things during the Civil War so they wouldn't be stolen. That's one of my only Bayo stories, I'm afraid, but...
That's such a classic Southern story.
It is.
What did they bury?
Silver and china, mostly silverware, I believe, the most valuable things. Maybe some jewelry.
Are they certain they dug it all up?
Oh, yes.
They got it all back?
They got it all back. It was saved.
The Europeans came here to stay in the earliest years of the 18th century. Our next stop along the Red is a visit with more recent transplants. Sacred Heart Elementary lies on the northern frontier of Catholic South Louisiana. This is Moreauville, near Marksville. For 50 years, this has been the Louisiana hometown of the Sisters of Our Lady of Sorrows. They teach children the alphabet and a love of Jesus Christ. In this state, 30 sisters of the order are from India, Mexico, the Philippines, Texas, 6 from Louisiana, and 50 years ago, 14 young nuns from Italy began a history here of serving God by serving the least of his people. In 1947, Sister Martina Bernabe came to Moreauville to teach poor black children.
You know, people would come and they would come to see us like we were strange people coming from the other planet. And we all were there, but since our English was limited, we just listened and without really understanding what they were saying. And we were just singing. See, when people would come to visit us, we would sing a song for them.
Sister Martina remembers post-war Italy. The country was shattered. Il Duce, the fascist Mussolini, had been hung. The ruins of Rome ruined moreover. The Marshall Plan and Truman doctrines would help rebuild Europe. There was no such plan for poor black kids. Sister Mary Bacelli says she had always wanted to be a missionary in a poor country.
Do you remember thinking about where you were going and what kind of place this was, Louisiana?
Well, I was interested, so we have some lesson in English lessons, and then I study the history, the geography. But since I was young, I want to be a missionary. I want to go work with the black children.
The young nuns did not know what poor country they would serve as missionaries. It was all happenstance, or of course the will of God. How they would end up in Louisiana, a chance meeting after the war between the Bishop of Alexandria and a Vatican emissary. Bishop Charles Greco asked for some nuns to teach in central Louisiana. Sister Helen Marcantonini was among the first to come by boat to America, by train to Alexandria, by bus to Moreauville, 14 days in transit.
So we arrived in Alexandria on the 23rd of October.
13 days after you left Italy.
Yes, and so we then there they met us, some clergymen and a friend that they said they were speaking Italian, some ladies, but they would not really speak Italian. We could not understand anything they were talking about. They said, we're going to eat you, we're going to dress you and all these things, but we could not really make anything out.
Their original facility for handicapped children was in Clark's. Here they are moving to a larger one, capable of housing more students. Older people around here tell stories of the little Italian nuns who came to serve 50 years ago, how they rode bicycles at first, how they were always busy. Some things change as the schools get larger, but they're still always busy. Is this sort of dedication soon to be lost in Louisiana? Sadly, the numbers are dire. In America, from a high of 180,000 a generation ago, the number of nuns is down to 90,000, and the median age is nearly 70 years old. At a celebration mass, the Sisters of Our Lady of Sorrows were showered with gratitude from former students and the people of central Louisiana. Yet the current Bishop of Alexandria paused only briefly to thank them. After 50 years on the job, he asked them to do more. The rest of us might think that callous, ungrateful, but the sisters, by their vows, are not the rest of us, are they? The sisters came here today praying for the same thing they always do, a deeper calling to the greatest work, serving God by serving the least of his people.
The people around here were kind of poor, but they were good, kind, and generous. And as they still are good and generous to us. They always appreciated what we did for them.
My dream came true. I wanted to be a missionary, and I want to die over here.
Doing God's work.
Yes.
And that is the end of our journey for now. But there are many more river stories to tell. In our next Searches for Lost Louisiana, you and I will visit 2 other beautiful streams. The Red disbands itself east of here at a place called 3 Rivers. It becomes the Atchafalaya and contributes even to the Mississippi. In our journey, we've found the Red River contributes quite a bit more to all of Louisiana.